Chapter 1 of The Enemies of Books. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Enemies of Books by William Blades. Chapter 1 Fire. There are many of the forces of nature which tend to injure books. But among them all, not one has been half so destructive as fire. It would be tedious to write out a bare list only of the numerous libraries and bibliographical treasures which, in one way or another, have been seized by the Fire King as his own. Chance conflagrations, fanatic incendiarism, judicial bonfires, and even household stoves have, time after time, thinned the treasures as well as the rubbish of past ages, until probably not 1,000th part of the books that have been are still extant. This destruction cannot, however, be reckoned as all loss, for had not the cleansing fires removed mountains of rubbish from our midst, strong destructive measures would have become a necessity from sheer want of space in which to store so many volumes. Before the invention of printing, books were comparatively scarce, and knowing as we do how very difficult it is, even after the steam press has been working for half a century, to make a collection of 500,000 books, we are forced to receive with great incredulity the accounts in old writers of the wonderful extent of ancient libraries. The historian Gibbon, very incredulous in many things, accepts without questioning the fables told upon this subject. No doubt the libraries of manuscripts collected generation after generation by the Egyptian Ptolemies became in the course of time the most extensive ever then known, and were famous throughout the world for the costliness of their ornamentation and the importance of their untold contents. 2 of these were at Alexandria, the larger of which was in the quarter called Bruchium. These volumes, like all manuscripts of those early ages, were written on sheets of parchment, having a wooden roller at each end, so that the reader needed only to unroll a portion at a time. During Caesar's Alexandrian War, B.C. 48, the larger collection was consumed by fire, and again burnt by the Saracens in A.D. 640. An immense loss was inflicted upon mankind thereby. But when we are told of 700,000 or even 500,000 of such volumes being destroyed, we instinctively feel that such numbers must be a great exaggeration. Equally incredulous must we be when we read of 500,000 volumes being burnt at Carthage some centuries later, and other similar accounts. Among the earliest records of the wholesale destruction of books is that narrated by St. Luke, when after the preaching of Paul, many of the Ephesians, which used curious arts, brought their books together and burned them before all men, and they counted the price of them, and found it 50,000 pieces of silver. Acts chapter 19, verse 19. Doubtless these books of idolatrous divination and alchemy, of enchantments and witchcraft, were righteously destroyed by those to whom they had been and might again be spiritually injurious, and doubtless had they escaped the fire then, not one of them would have survived to the present time, no manuscript of that age being now extant. Nevertheless, I must confess to a certain amount of mental disquietude and uneasiness when I think of books worth 50,000 denarii, or, speaking roughly, say 18,750 pounds of our modern money, being made into bonfires. What curious illustrations of early heathenism, of devil worship, of serpent worship, of sun worship, and other archaic forms of religion, of early astrological and chemical lore, derived from the Egyptians, the Persians, the Greeks. What abundance of superstitious observances and what is now termed folklore. What riches, too, for the philological student did those many books contain, and how famous would the library now be that could boast of possessing but a few of them? Note: the received opinion is that the pieces of silver here mentioned were Roman denarii, which were the silver pieces then commonly used in Ephesus. If now we weigh a denarius against modern silver, it is exactly equal to 9 pence, and 50,000 times 9 pence gives 1,875 pounds. It is always a difficult matter to arrive at a just estimate of the relative value of the same coin in a different age, but reckoning that money then had at least 10 times the purchasing value of money now, we arrive at what was probably about the value of the magical books burnt, namely 18,750 pounds. End note. The ruins of Ephesus bear unimpeachable evidence that the city was very extensive and had magnificent buildings. It was one of the free cities, governing itself. Its trade in shrines and idols was very extensive, being spread through all known lands. There the magical arts were remarkably prevalent, and notwithstanding the numerous converts made by the early Christians, the Ephesia Grammata, or little scrolls upon which magic sentences were written, formed an extensive trade up to the 4th century. These writings were used for divination, as a protection against the evil eye, and generally as charms against all evil. They were carried about the person, so that probably thousands of them were thrown into the flames by St. Paul's hearers when his glowing words convinced them of their superstition. Imagine an open space near the grand temple of Diana, with fine buildings around. Slightly raised above the crowd, the apostle, preaching with great power and persuasion concerning superstition, holds in thrall the assembled multitude. On the outskirts of the crowd are numerous bonfires, upon which Jew and Gentile are throwing into the flames bundle upon bundle of scrolls, while an Asiarch with his peace officers looks on with the conventional stolidity of policemen in all ages and all nations. It must have been an impressive scene, and many a worse subject has been chosen for the walls of the Royal Academy. Books in those early times, whether orthodox or heterodox, appear to have had a precarious existence. The heathens, at each fresh outbreak of persecution, burnt all the Christian writings they could find, and the Christians, when they got the upper hand, retaliated with interest upon the pagan literature. The Mohammedan reason for destroying books: if they contain what is in the Koran, they are superfluous, and if they contain anything opposed to it, they are immoral, seems, indeed, mutatis mutandis, to have been the general rule for all such devastators. The invention of printing made the entire destruction of any author's works much more difficult. So quickly and so extensively did books spread through all lands. On the other hand, as books multiplied, so did destruction go hand in hand with production, and soon were printed books doomed to suffer in the same penal fires that up to then had been fed on manuscripts only. At Cremona, in 1569, 12,000 books printed in Hebrew were publicly burnt as heretical, simply on account of their language, and Cardinal Jimenez, at the capture of Granada, treated 5,000 copies of the Koran in the same way. At the time of the Reformation in England, a great destruction of books took place. The antiquarian Bale, writing in 1587, thus speaks of the shameful fate of the monastic libraries. A great number of them which purchased those superstitious mansions, monasteries, reserved of those library books some to serve their jakes, and some to scour their candlesticks, and some to rub their boots. Some they sold to the grocers and soap sellers, and some they sent oversea to ye's bookbinders, not in small number, but at times whole ships full, to ye's wondering of foreign nations. Yea, ye's universities of this realm are not all clear in this detestable fact. But cursed is that belly which seeketh to be fed with such ungodly gains, and so deeply shameth his natural country. I know a merchantman, which shall at this time be nameless, that bought ye's contents of 2 noble libraries for 40 shillings price. A shame it is to be spoken. This stuff hath he occupied in ye's stead of grey paper, by ye's space of more than these 10 years, and yet he bath store enough for as many years to come. A prodigious example is this, and to be abhorred of all men which love their nation as they should do. The monks kept them under dust. Ye's idle-headed priests regarded them not. Their later owners have most shamefully abused them, and ye's covetous merchants have sold them away into foreign nations for money. How the imagination recoils at the idea of Caxton's translation of the Metamorphoses of Ovid, or perhaps his Life of the Earl of Oxenford, together with many another book from our first presses, not a fragment of which do we now possess, being used for baking pies. At the Great Fire of London in 1666, the number of books burnt was enormous. Not only in private houses and corporate and church libraries were priceless collections reduced to cinders, but an immense stock of books removed from Paternoster Row by the stationers for safety was burnt to ashes in the vaults of St. Paul's Cathedral. Coming nearer to our own day, how thankful we ought to be for the preservation of the Cotton Library. Great was the consternation in the literary world of 1731 when they heard of the fire at Ashburnham House, Westminster, where at that time the Cotton manuscripts were deposited. By great exertions the fire was conquered, but not before many manuscripts had been quite destroyed and many others injured. Much skill was shown in the partial restoration of these books, charred almost beyond recognition. They were carefully separated, leaf by leaf, soaked in a chemical solution, and then pressed flat between sheets of transparent paper. A curious heap of scorched leaves, previous to any treatment, and looking like a monster wasp's nest, may be seen in a glass case in the manuscript department of the British Museum, showing the condition to which many other volumes had been reduced. Just 100 years ago, the mob in the Birmingham riots burnt the valuable library of Dr. Priestley, and in the Gordon riots were burnt the literary and other collections of Lord Mansfield, the celebrated judge, he who had the courage first to decide that the slave who reached the English shore was thenceforward a free man. The loss of the latter library drew from the poet Cooper 2 short and weak poems. The poet first deplores the destruction of the valuable printed books, and then the irretrievable loss to history by the burning of his lordship's many personal manuscripts and contemporary documents. Their pages mangled, burnt and torn, the loss was his alone, but ages yet to come shall mourn the burning of his own. The second poem commences with the following doggerel. When wit and genius meet their doom in all-devouring flame, they tell us of the fate of Rome, and bid us fear the same. The much finer and more extensive library of Dr. Priestley was left unnoticed and unlamented by the orthodox poet, who probably felt a complacent satisfaction at the destruction of heterodox books, the owner being a Unitarian minister. The magnificent library of Strasbourg was burnt by the shells of the German army in 1870, then disappeared forever, together with other unique documents, the original records of the famous lawsuits between Gutenberg, one of the first printers, and his partners, upon the right understanding of which depends the claim of Gutenberg to the invention of the art. The flames raged between high brick walls, roaring louder than a blast furnace. Seldom, indeed, have Mars and Pluto had so dainty a sacrifice offered at their shrines. For over all the din of battle and the reverberation of monster artillery, the burning leaves of the first printed Bible and many another priceless volume were wafted into the sky, the ashes floating for miles on the heated air, and carrying to the astonished countryman the first news of the devastation of his capital. When the Offor collection was put to the hammer by Messrs. Southby and Wilkinson, the well-known auctioneers of Wellington Street, and when about 3 days of the sale had been gone through, a fire occurred in the adjoining house, and gaining possession of the sale rooms made a speedy end of the unique Bunyan and other rarities then on show. I was allowed to see the ruins on the following day, and by means of a ladder and some scrambling managed to enter the sale room, where parts of the floor still remained. It was a fearful sight, those scorched rows of volumes still on the shelves, and curious was it to notice how the flames, burning off the backs of the books first, had then run up behind the shelves and so attacked the foredges of the volumes standing upon them, leaving the majority of them with a perfectly untouched oval center of white paper and plain print, while the whole surrounding parts were but a mass of black cinders. The salvage was sold in one lot for a small sum, and the purchaser, after a good deal of sorting and mending and binding, placed about 1,000 volumes for sale at Messrs. Puttick and Simpson's in the following year. So, too, when the curious old library, which was a gallery of the Dutch church, Austin Friars, was nearly destroyed in the fire which devastated the church in 1862, the books which escaped were sadly injured. Not long before, I had spent some hours there hunting for English 15th century books, and shall never forget the state of dirt in which I came away. Without anyone to care for them, the books had remained untouched for many a decade, damp dust 1/2 inch thick having settled upon them. Then came the fire, and while the roof was all ablaze, streams of hot water, like a boiling deluge, washed down upon them. The wonder was they were not turned into a muddy pulp. After all was over, the whole of the library, no portion of which could legally be given away, was lent forever to the Corporation of London. Scorched and sodden, the salvage came into the hands of Mr. Overall, their indefatigable librarian. In a hired attic, he hung up the volumes that would bear it over strings like clothes to dry, and there, for weeks and weeks, were the stained, distorted volumes, often without covers, often in single leaves, carefully tended and dry-nursed. Washing, sizing, pressing, and binding effected wonders, and no one who today looks upon the attractive little alcove in the Guildhall Library, labelled Bibliotheca Ecclesiae Londino-Belgiae, and sees the rows of handsomely lettered backs, could imagine that not long ago this, the most curious portion of the city's literary collections, was in a state when a £5 note would have seemed more than full value for the lot. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Maria Kasper. Chapter 2 of The Enemies of Books by William Blades. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Water. Next to fire, we must rank water, in its two forms, liquid and vapor, as the greatest destroyer of books. Thousands of volumes have been actually drowned at sea, and no more heard of them than of the sailors to whose charge they were committed. Disraeli narrates that about the year 1700, Heer Hudde, an opulent burgomaster of Middelburg, travelled for 30 years disguised as a mandarin throughout the length and breadth of the Celestial Empire. Everywhere he collected books, and his extensive literary treasures were at length safely shipped for transmission to Europe. But to the irreparable loss of his native country they never reached their destination, the vessel having foundered in a storm. In 1785 died the famous Maffei Pinelli, whose library was celebrated throughout the world. It had been collected by the Pinelli family for many generations, and comprised an extraordinary number of Greek, Latin, and Italian works, many of them first editions, beautifully illuminated, together with numerous manuscripts dating from the 11th to the 16th century. The whole library was sold by the executors to Mr. Edwards, bookseller of Pall Mall, who placed the volumes in 3 vessels for transport from Venice to London. Pursued by corsairs, one of the vessels was captured, but the pirate, disgusted at not finding any treasure, threw all the books into the sea. The other 2 vessels escaped and delivered their freight safely, and in 1789-1790 the books which had been so near destruction were sold at the Great Room in Conduit Street for more than £9,000. These pirates were more excusable than Mohammed II, who, upon the capture of Constantinople in the 15th century, after giving up the devoted city to be sacked by his licentious soldiers, ordered the books in all the churches, as well as the great library of the Emperor Constantine, containing 120,000 manuscripts, to be thrown into the sea. In the shape of rain, water has frequently caused irreparable injury. Positive wet is fortunately of rare occurrence in a library, but is very destructive when it does come, and if long continued, the substance of the paper succumbs to the unhealthy influence, and rots until all fiber disappears, and the paper is reduced to a white decay which crumbles into powder when handled. Few old libraries in England are now so thoroughly neglected as they were 30 years ago. The state of many of our collegiate and cathedral libraries was at that time simply appalling. I could mention many instances, one especially, where a window having been left broken for a long time, the ivy had pushed through and crept over a row of books, each of which was worth hundreds of pounds. In rainy weather, the water was conducted as by a pipe along the tops of the books, and soaked through the whole. In another and smaller collection, the rain came straight onto a bookcase through a skylight, saturating continually the top shelf, containing Caxton's and other early English books, one of which, although rotten, was sold soon after by permission of the Charity Commissioners for £200. Germany, too, the very birthplace of printing, allows similar destruction to go on unchecked if the following letter, which appeared about a year ago, 1879, in the Academy, has any truth in it. For some time past, the condition of the library at Wolfenbüttel has been most disgraceful. The building is in so unsafe a condition that portions of the walls and ceilings have fallen in, and the many treasures in books and manuscripts contained in it are exposed to damp and decay. An appeal has been issued that this valuable collection may not be allowed to perish for want of funds, and that it may also be now at length removed to Brunswick, since Wolfenbüttel is entirely deserted as an intellectual center. No false sentimentality regarding the memory of its former custodians, Leibniz and Lessing, should hinder this project. Lessing himself would have been the first to urge that the library and its utility should be considered above all things. The collection of books at Wolfenbüttel is simply magnificent, and I cannot but hope that the above report was exaggerated. Were these books to be injured, for the want of a small sum spent on the roof, it would be a lasting disgrace to the nation. There are so many genuine book lovers in Fatherland that the commission of such a crime would seem incredible, did not bibliographical history teem with similar desecrations. Note: this was written in 1879, since which time a new building has been erected. End note. Water in the form of vapor is a great enemy of books, the damp attacking both outside and inside. Outside, it fosters the growth of a white mold or fungus, which vegetates upon the edges of the leaves, upon the sides, and in the joints of the binding. It is easily wiped off, but not without leaving a plain mark where the mold spots have been. Under the microscope, a mold spot is seen to be a miniature forest of lovely trees, covered with a beautiful white foliage, upas trees, whose roots are embedded in the leather and destroy its texture. Inside the book, damp encourages the growth of those ugly brown spots which so often disfigure prints and livres de luxe. Especially it attacks books printed in the early part of this century, when paper makers had just discovered that they could bleach their rags, and perfectly white paper, well pressed after printing, had become the fashion. This paper, from the inefficient means used to neutralize the bleach, carried the seeds of decay in itself, and when exposed to any damp, soon became discolored with brown stains. Dr. Dibdin's extravagant bibliographical works are mostly so injured, and although the doctor's bibliography is very incorrect, and his spun-out inanities and wearisome affectations often annoy one, yet his books are so beautifully illustrated, and he is so full of personal anecdote and chit-chat, that it grieves the heart to see foxy stains common in his most superb works. In a perfectly dry and warm library, these spots would probably remain undeveloped, but many endowed as well as private libraries are not in daily use, and are often injured from a false idea that a hard frost and prolonged cold do no injury to a library so long as the weather is dry. The fact is that books should never be allowed to get really cold, for when a thaw comes and the weather sets in warm, the air, laden with damp, penetrates the inmost recesses, and working its way between the volumes and even between the leaves, deposits upon their cold surface its moisture. The best preventative of this is a warm atmosphere during the frost, sudden heating when the frost has gone being entirely useless. Our worst enemies are sometimes our real friends, and perhaps the best way of keeping libraries entirely free from damp is to circulate our enemy in the shape of hot water through pipes laid under the floor. The facilities now offered for heating such pipes from the outside are so great, the expense comparatively so small, and the direct gain in the expulsion of damp so decided, that where it can be accomplished without much trouble, it is well worth the doing. At the same time, no system of heating should be allowed to supersede the open grate, which supplies a ventilation to the room as useful to the health of the books as to the health of the occupier. A coal fire is objectionable on many grounds. It is dangerous, dirty, and dusty. On the other hand, an asbestos fire, where the lumps are judiciously laid, gives all the warmth and ventilation of a common fire without any of its annoyances, and to anyone who loves to be independent of servants, and to know that however deeply he may sleep over his copy, his fire will not fail to keep awake, an asbestos stove is invaluable. It is a mistake also to imagine that keeping the best-bound volumes in a glass-doored bookcase is a preservative. The damp air will certainly penetrate, and as the absence of ventilation will assist in the formation of mold, the books will be worse off than if they had been placed on open shelves. If security be desirable, by all means abolish the glass and place ornamental brass wirework in its stead. Like the writers of old cookery books, who stamped special receipts with the testimony of personal experience, I can say, probatum est. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Maria Kasper. Chapter 3 of The Enemies of Books by William Blades. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Gas and Heat. What a valuable servant is gas, and how dreadfully we should cry out were it to be banished from our homes. And yet no one who loves his books should allow a single jet in his library, unless indeed he can afford a sunlight, which is the form in which it is used in some public libraries, where the whole of the fumes are carried at once into the open air. Unfortunately, I can speak from experience of the dire effect of gas in a confined space. Some years ago, when placing the shelves round the small room which by a euphemism is called my library, I took the precaution of making 2 self-acting ventilators which communicated directly with the outer air just under the ceiling. For economy of space, as well as of temper, for lamps of all kinds are sore trials, I had a gaselier of 3 lights over the table. The effect was to cause great heat in the upper regions, and in the course of a year or 2, the leather valance which hung from the window, as well as the fringe which dropped half an inch from each shelf to keep out the dust, was just like tinder, and in some parts actually fell to the ground by its own weight, while the backs of the books upon the top shelves were perished and crumbled away when touched, being reduced to the consistency of Scotch snuff. This was, of course, due to the sulphur in the gas fumes. I remember having a book some years ago from the top shelf in the library of the London institution where gas is used, and the whole of the back fell off in my hands, although the volume in other respects seemed quite uninjured. Thousands more were in a similar plight. As the paper of the volumes is uninjured, it might be objected that, after all, gas is not so much the enemy of the book itself as of its covering. But then rebinding always leaves a book smaller, and often deprives it of leaves at the beginning or end, which the binder's wisdom has thought useless. Oh, the havoc I have seen committed by binders! You may assume your most impressive aspect, you may write down your instructions as if you were making your last will and testament, you may swear you will not pay if your books are ploughed. 'Tis all in vain. The creed of the binder is very short, and comprised in a single article, and that article is the one vile word, shavings. But not now will I follow this depressing subject. Binders, as enemies of books, deserve and shall have a whole chapter to themselves. It is much easier to decry gas than to find a remedy. Sunlights require special arrangements and are very expensive on account of the quantity of gas consumed. The library illumination of the future promises to be the electric light. If only steady and moderate in price, it would be a great boon to public libraries, and perhaps the day is not far distant when it will replace gas even in private houses. That will indeed be a day of jubilee to the literary laborer. The injury done by gas is so generally acknowledged by the heads of our national libraries that it is strictly excluded from their domains, although the danger from explosion and fire, even if the results of combustion were innocuous, would be sufficient cause for its banishment. The electric light has been in use for some months in the reading room of the British Museum, and is a great boon to the readers. The light is not quite equally diffused, and you must choose particular positions if you want to work happily. There is a great objection, too, in the humming fizz which accompanies the action of the electricity. There is a still greater objection when small pieces of hot chalk fall on your bald head, an annoyance which has been lately, 1880, entirely removed by placing a receptacle beneath each burner. You require also to become accustomed to the whiteness of the light before you can altogether forget it. But with all its faults, it confers a great boon upon students, enabling them not only to work 3 hours longer in the winter time, but restoring to them the use of foggy, dark days in which formerly no book work at all could be pursued. Note: 1887. The system in use is still Siemens, but owing to long experience and improvements, it is not now open to the above objections. End note. Heat alone, without any noxious fumes, is, if continuous, very injurious to books, and without gas bindings may be utterly destroyed by desiccation, the leather losing all its natural oils by long exposure to much heat. It is therefore a great pity to place books high up in a room where heat of any kind is, as it must rise to the top, and if sufficient to be of comfort to the readers below, is certain to be hot enough above to injure the bindings. The surest way to preserve your books in health is to treat them as you would your own children, who are sure to sicken if confined in an atmosphere which is impure, too hot, too cold, too damp, or too dry. It is just the same with the progeny of literature. If any credence may be given to monkish legends, books have sometimes been preserved in this world only to meet a desiccating fate in the world to come. The story is probably an invention of the enemy to throw discredit on the learning and ability of the preaching friars, an order which was at constant war with the illiterate secular clergy. It runs thus. In the year 1439, 2 Minorite friars, who had all their lives collected books, died. In accordance with popular belief, they were at once conducted before the heavenly tribunal to hear their doom, taking with them 2 asses laden with books. At heaven's gate the porter demanded, "Whence come ye?" The Minorites replied, "From a monastery of St. Francis." "Oh," said the porter, "then St. Francis shall be your judge." So that saint was summoned, and at the sight of the friars and their burden, demanded who they were and why they had brought so many books with them. "We are Minorites," they humbly replied, "and we have brought these few books with us as a solatium in the New Jerusalem." "And you, when on earth, practice the good they teach?" sternly demanded the saint, who read their characters at a glance. Their faltering reply was sufficient, and the blessed saint at once passed judgment as follows: "Insomuch as, seduced by a foolish vanity, and against your vows of poverty, you have amassed this multitude of books, and thereby and therefore have neglected your duties and broken the rules of your order, you are now sentenced to read your books forever and ever in the fires of hell." Immediately a roaring noise filled the air, and a flaming chasm opened in which friars and asses and books were suddenly engulfed. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Maria Kasper. Chapter 4 of The Enemies of Books by William Blades. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Dust and Neglect. Dust upon books to any extent points to neglect, and neglect means more or less slow decay. A well-gilt top to a book is a great preventive against damage by dust, while to leave books with rough tops and unprotected is sure to produce stains and dirty margins. In olden times, when few persons had private collections of books, the collegiate and corporate libraries were of great use to students. The librarian's duties were then no sinecure, and there was little opportunity for dust to find a resting place. The 19th century and the steam press ushered in a new era. By degrees, the libraries which were unendowed fell behind the age and were consequently neglected. No new works found their way in, and the obsolete old books were left uncared for and unvisited. I have seen many old libraries, the doors of which remained unopened from week's end to week's end, where you inhaled the dust of paper decay with every breath, and could not take up a book without sneezing, where old boxes, full of older literature, served as preserves for the bookworm, without even an autumn battue to thin the breed. Occasionally, these libraries were, I speak of 30 years ago, put even to vile uses such as would have shocked all ideas of propriety could our ancestors have foreseen their fate. I recall vividly a bright summer morning many years ago, when, in search of Caxtons, I entered the inner quadrangle of a certain wealthy college in one of our learned universities. The buildings around were charming in their gray tones and shady nooks. They had a noble history, too, and their scholarly sons were, and are, not unworthy successors of their ancestral renown. The sun shone warmly, and most of the casements were open. From one came curling a whiff of tobacco, from another the hum of conversation, from a third the tones of a piano. A couple of undergraduates sauntered on the shady side, arm in arm, with broken caps and torn gowns, proud insignia of their last term. The gray stone walls were covered with ivy, except where an old dial with its antiquated Latin inscription kept count of the sun's ascent. The chapel on one side, only distinguishable from the rooms by the shape of its windows, seemed to keep watch over the morality of the foundation, just as the dining hall opposite, from whence issued a white-aproned cook, did of its worldly prosperity. As you trod the level pavement, you passed comfortable, nay dainty apartments, where lace curtains at the windows, antimacassars on the chairs, the silver biscuit box, and the thin-stemmed wine-glass moderated academic toils. Gilt-backed books on gilded shelf or table caught the eye, and as you turned your glance from the luxurious interiors to the well-shorn lawn in the quad, with its classic fountain also gilded by sunbeams, the mental vision saw plainly written over the whole the union of luxury and learning. Surely here, thought I, if anywhere, the old-world literature will be valued and nursed with gracious care. So with a pleasing sense of the general congruity of all around me, I inquired for the rooms of the librarian. Nobody seemed to be quite sure of his name, or upon whom the bibliographical mantle had descended. His post, it seemed, was honorary and a sinecure, being imposed as a rule upon the youngest fellow. No one cared for the appointment, and as a matter of course the keys of office had but distant acquaintance with the lock. At last I was rewarded with success, and politely but mutely conducted by the librarian into his kingdom of dust and silence. The dark portraits of past benefactors looked after us from their dusty old frames in dim astonishment as we passed, evidently wondering whether we meant work. Book decay, that peculiar flavor which haunts certain libraries, was heavy in the air. The floor was dusty, making the sunbeams as we passed bright with atoms. The shelves were dusty. The stands in the middle were thick with dust. The old leather table in the bow window and the chairs on either side were very dusty. Replying to a question, my conductor thought there was a manuscript catalogue of the library somewhere, but thought also that it was not easy to find any books by it, and he knew not at the minute where to put his hand upon it. The library, he said, was of little use now, as the fellows had their own books, and very seldom required 17th and 18th century editions, and no new books had been added to the collection for a long time. We passed down a few steps into an inner library, where piles of early folios were wasting away on the ground. Beneath an old ebony table were 2 long carved oak chests. I lifted the lid of one, and at the top was a once white surplice covered with dust, and beneath was a mass of tracts, Commonwealth quartos, unbound, a prey to worms and decay. All was neglect. The outer door of this room, which was open, was nearly on a level with the quadrangle. Some coats and trousers and boots were upon the ebony table, and a gyp was brushing away at them just within the door. In wet weather he performed these functions entirely within the library, as innocent of the incongruity of his position as my guide himself. "Oh, Richard of Bury," I sighed, "for a sharp stone from your sling to pierce with indignant sarcasm the mental armor of these college dullards." Happily, things are altered now, and the disgrace of such neglect no longer hangs on the college. Let us hope, in these days of revived respect for antiquity, that no other college library is in a similar plight. Not Englishmen alone are guilty, however, of such unloving treatment of their bibliographical treasures. The following is translated from an interesting work just published in Paris, and shows how, even at this very time and in the center of the literary activity of France, books meet their fate. Monsieur Derome, loquitur. Let us now enter the communal library of some large provincial town. The interior has a lamentable appearance. Dust and disorder have made it their home. It has a librarian, but he has the consideration of a porter only, and goes but once a week to see the state of the books committed to his care. They are in a bad state, piled in heaps and perishing in corners for want of attention and binding. At this present time, 1879, more than one public library in Paris could be mentioned in which thousands of books are received annually, all of which will have disappeared in the course of 50 years or so for want of binding. There are rare books impossible to replace, falling to pieces because no care is given to them. That is to say, they are left unbound, a prey to dust and the worm, and cannot be touched without dismemberment. All history shows that this neglect belongs not to any particular age or nation. I extract the following story from Edmond Werdet's Histoire du Livre. The poet Boccaccio, when traveling in Apulia, was anxious to visit the celebrated convent of Mount Cassin, especially to see its library, of which he had heard much. He accosted with great courtesy one of the monks whose countenance attracted him, and begged him to have the kindness to show him the library. "See for yourself," said the monk brusquely, pointing at the same time to an old stone staircase broken with age. Boccaccio hastily mounted in great joy at the prospect of a grand bibliographical treat. Soon he reached the room, which was without key or even door as protection to its treasures. What was his astonishment to see that the grass growing in the window sills actually darkened the room, and that all the books and seats were an inch thick in dust. In utter astonishment he lifted one book after another. All were manuscripts of extreme antiquity, but all were dreadfully dilapidated. Many had lost whole sections, which had been violently extracted, and in many all the blank margins of the vellum had been cut away. In fact, the mutilation was thorough. Grieved at seeing the work and the wisdom of so many illustrious men fallen into the hands of custodians so unworthy, Boccaccio descended with tears in his eyes. In the cloisters he met another monk, and inquired of him how the manuscripts had become so mutilated. "Oh," he replied, "we are obliged, you know, to earn a few sous for our needs, so we cut away the blank margins of the manuscripts for writing upon, and make of them small books of devotion which we sell to women and children." As a postscript to this story, Mr. Timmins of Birmingham informs me that the treasures of the Monte Cassino library are better cared for now than they were in Boccaccio's days, the worthy prior being proud of his valuable manuscripts and very willing to show them. It will interest many readers to know that there is now a complete printing office, lithographic as well as typographic, at full work in one large room of the monastery, where their wonderful manuscript of Dante has already been reprinted, and where other facsimile works are now in progress. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Maria Kasper. Chapter 5 of The Enemies of Books by William Blades. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Ignorance and Bigotry. Ignorance, though not in the same category as fire and water, is a great destroyer of books. At the Reformation, so strong was the antagonism of the people generally to anything like the old idolatry of the Romish Church, that they destroyed by thousands books, secular as well as sacred, if they contained but illuminated letters. Unable to read, they saw no difference between romance and a psalter, between King Arthur and King David. And so the paper books with all their artistic ornaments went to the bakers to heat their ovens, and the parchment manuscripts, however beautifully illuminated, to the binders and bootmakers. There is another kind of ignorance which has often worked destruction, as shown by the following anecdote, which is extracted from a letter written in 1862 by Monsieur Philaret Chasles to Mr. B. Beedham of Kimbolton. 10 years ago, when turning out an old closet in the Mazarin Library, of which I am librarian, I discovered at the bottom, under a lot of old rags and rubbish, a large volume. It had no cover nor title page, and had been used to light the fires of the librarians. This shows how great was the negligence toward our literary treasure before the Revolution, for the parish volume, which 60 years before had been placed in the Invalides, and which had certainly formed part of the original Mazarin collections, turned out to be a fine and genuine Caxton. I saw this identical volume in the Mazarin Library in April 1880. It is a noble copy of the first edition of the Golden Legend, 1483, but, of course, very imperfect. Among the millions of events in this world which cross and recross one another, remarkable coincidences must often occur, and a case exactly similar to that at the Mazarin Library happened about the same time in London, at the French Protestant Church St. Martin le Grand. Many years ago I discovered there, in a dirty pigeonhole close to the grate in the vestry, a fearfully mutilated copy of Caxton's edition of the Canterbury Tales, with woodcuts.
Like the book at Paris, it had long been used, leaf by leaf, in utter ignorance of its value, to light the vestry fire. Originally worth at least £800, it was then worth half, and of course I energetically drew the attention of the minister in charge to it, as well as to another grand folio by Rood and Hunt, 1480. Some years elapsed, and then the ecclesiastical commissioners took the foundation in hand. But when at last trustees were appointed, and the valuable library was rearranged and catalogued, this Caxton, together with the fine copy of Latterbury from the first Oxford press, had disappeared entirely. Whatever ignorance may have been displayed in the mutilation, quite another word should be applied to the disappearance. The following anecdote is so apropos that although it has lately appeared in number 1 of the Antiquary, I cannot resist the temptation of reprinting it as a warning to inheritors of old libraries. The account was copied by me years ago from a letter written in 1847 by the Reverend C. F. Newmarsh, rector of Pelham, to the Reverend S. R. Maitland, librarian to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it is as follows. In June 1844, a peddler called at a cottage in Blighton and asked an old widow named Naylor whether she had any rags to sell. She answered no, but offered him some old paper, and took from a shelf the Book of St. Albans and others, weighing 9 pounds, for which she received 9d. The peddler carried them through Gainsborough, tied up in string, past a chemist's shop, who, being used to buy old paper to wrap his drugs in, called the man in, and, struck by the appearance of the book, gave him 3 shillings for the lot. Not being able to read the colophon, he took it to an equally ignorant stationer, and offered it to him for a guinea, at which price he declined it, but proposed that it should be exposed in his window as a means of eliciting some information about it. It was accordingly placed there, with the label, "Very old curious work." A collector of books went in, and offered him half a crown for it, which excited the suspicion of the vendor. Soon after, Mr. Bird, vicar of Gainsborough, went in and asked the price, wishing to possess a very early specimen of printing, but not knowing the value of the book. While he was examining it, Stark, a very intelligent bookseller, came in, to whom Mr. Bird at once ceded the right of preemption. Stark betrayed such visible anxiety that the vendor, Smith, declined setting a price. Soon after, Sir C. Anderson of Lee, author of Ancient Models, came in and took away the book to collate, but brought it back in the morning, having found it imperfect in the middle, and offered £5 for it. Sir Charles had no book of reference to guide him to its value, but in the meantime Stark had employed a friend to obtain for him the refusal of it, and had undertaken to give for it a little more than any sum Sir Charles might offer. On finding that at least £5 could be got for it, Smith went to the chemist and gave him 2 guineas, and then sold it to Stark's agent for 7 guineas. Stark took it to London, and sold it at once to the Right Honourable Thomas Grenville for £70 or guineas. I have now shortly to state how it came that a book without covers of such extreme age was preserved. About 50 years since, the library of Thonnock Hall, in the parish of Gainsborough, the seat of the Hickman family, underwent great repairs, the books being sorted over by a most ignorant person, whose selection seems to have been determined by the coat. All books without covers were thrown into a great heap and condemned to all the purposes which Leland laments in the sack of the conventual libraries by the visitors. But they found favour in the eyes of a literate gardener, who begged leave to take what he liked home. He selected a large quantity of sermons preached before the House of Commons, local pamphlets, tracts from 1680 to 1710, opera books, etc. He made a list of them, which I found afterwards in the cottage. In the list, number 43, was Cotar Morris, or the Book of St. Albans. The old fellow was something of a herald, and drew in his books what he held to be his coat. After his death, all that could be stuffed into a large chest were put away in a garret, but a few favourites, and the book among them, remained on the kitchen shelves for years, till his son's widow grew so stalled of dusting them that she determined to sell them. Had she been in poverty, I should have urged the buyer, Stark, the duty of giving her a small sum out of his great gains. Such chances as this do not fall to a man's lot twice, but Edmund Werdet relates a story very similar indeed, and where also the plums fell into the lap of a London dealer. In 1775, the Recollet monks of Antwerp, wishing to make a reform, examined their library and determined to get rid of about 1,500 volumes, some manuscript and some printed, but all of which they considered as old rubbish of no value. At first they were thrown into the gardener's rooms, but after some months they decided in their wisdom to give the whole refuse to the gardener as a recognition of his long services. This man, wiser in his generation than these simple fathers, took the lot to Monsieur Vanderberg, an amateur and man of education. Monsieur Vanderberg took a cursory view, and then offered to buy them by weight at 6d. per pound. The bargain was at once concluded, and Monsieur Vanderberg had the books. Shortly after, Mr. Stark, well-known London bookseller, being in Antwerp, called on Mr. Vanderberg, and was shown the books. He at once offered 14,000 francs for them, which was accepted. Imagine the surprise and chagrin of the poor monks when they heard of it. They knew they had no remedy, and so dumbfounded were they by their own ignorance that they humbly requested Monsieur Vanderberg to relieve their minds by returning some portion of his large gains. He gave them 1,200 francs. The great Shakespearean and other discoveries, which were found in a garret at Lamport Hall in 1867 by Mr. Edmonds, are too well known and too recent to need description. In this case, mere chance seems to have led to the preservation of works the very existence of which set the ears of all lovers of Shakespeare a-tingling. In the summer of 1877, a gentleman with whom I was well acquainted took lodgings in Preston Street, Brighton. The morning after his arrival, he found in the W.C. some leaves of an old black-letter book. He asked permission to retain them, and inquired if there were any more where they came from. 2 or 3 other fragments were found, and the landlady stated that her father, who was fond of antiquities, had at one time a chest full of old black-letter books, that upon his death they were preserved till she was tired of seeing them, and then, supposing them of no value, she had used them for waste, that for 2 years and a half they had served for various household purposes, but she had just come to the end of them. The fragments preserved, and now in my possession, are a goodly portion of one of the most rare books from the press of Wynkyn de Worde, Caxton's successor. The title is a curious woodcut with the words Gesta Romanorum engraved in an odd-shaped black letter. It has also numerous rude woodcuts throughout. It was from this very work that Shakespeare in all probability derived the story of the 3 caskets, which in The Merchant of Venice forms so integral a portion of the plot. Only think of that cloaca being supplied daily with such dainty bibliographical treasures. In the Lansdowne collection at the British Museum is a volume containing 3 manuscript dramas of Queen Elizabeth's time, and on a fly-leaf is a list of 58 plays, with this note at the foot, in the handwriting of the well-known antiquary Warburton. After I had been many years collecting these manuscript plays, through my own carelessness and the ignorance of my servant, they was unluckily burned or put under pie bottoms. Some of these plays are preserved in print, but others are quite unknown, and they perished forever when used as pie bottoms. Mr. W. B. Rye, late keeper of the printed books at our great National Library, thus writes, "On the subject of ignorance, you should some day, when at the British Museum, look at Lydgate's translation of Boccaccio's Fall of Princes, printed by Pinson in 1494. It is liber rarissimus. This copy, when perfect, had been very fine and quite uncut. On one fine summer afternoon in 1874, it was brought to me by a tradesman living at Lamberhurst. Many of the leaves had been cut into squares, and the whole had been rescued from a tobacconist's shop, where the pieces were being used to wrap up tobacco and snuff. The owner wanted to buy a new silk gown for his wife, and was delighted with 3 guineas for this purpose. You will notice how cleverly the British Museum binder has joined the leaves, making it, though still imperfect, a fine book." Referring to the carelessness exhibited by some custodians of parish registers, Mr. Noble, who has had great experience in such matter, writes, "A few months ago I wanted a search made of the time of Charles I. in one of the most interesting registers in a large town, which shall be nameless, in England. I wrote to the custodian of it and asked him kindly to do the search for me, and if he was unable to read the names, to get someone who understood the writing of that date to decipher the entries for me. I did not have a reply for a fortnight, but one morning the postman brought me a very large unregistered book packet, which I found to be the original parish registers. He, however, addressed a note with it, stating that he thought it best to send me the document itself to look at, and begged me to be good enough to return the register to him as soon as done with. He evidently wished to serve me, his ignorance of responsibility without doubt proving his kindly disposition, and on that account alone I forbear to name him. But I can assure you I was heartily glad to have a letter from him in due time, announcing that the precious documents were once more locked up in the parish chest. Certainly I think such as he to be enemies of books, don't you?" Bigotry also has many sins to answer for. The late Monsieur Muller of Amsterdam, a bookseller of European fame, wrote to me as follows a few weeks before his death. "Of course we also in Holland have many enemies of books, and if I were happy enough to have your spirit and style, I would try to write a companion volume to yours. Now I think the best thing I can do is to give you somewhat of my experience. You say that the discovery of printing has made the destruction of anybody's books difficult. At this I am bound to say that the Inquisition did succeed most successfully, by burning heretical books, in destroying numerous volumes invaluable for their wholesome contents. Indeed, I beg to state to you the amazing fact that here in Holland exists an ultramontane society called Old Paper, which is under the sanction of the 6 Catholic bishops of the Netherlands, and is spread over the whole kingdom. The openly avowed object of this society is to buy up and to destroy as waste paper all the Protestant and liberal Catholic newspapers, pamphlets, and books, the price of which is offered to the Pope as denier de Saint-Pierre. Of course, this society is very little known among Protestants, and many have denied even its existence, but I have been fortunate enough to obtain a printed circular issued by one of the bishops containing statistics of the astounding mass of paper thus collected, producing in one district alone the sum of £1,200 in 3 months. I need not tell you that this work is strongly promoted by the Catholic clergy. You can have no idea of the difficulty we now have in procuring certain books published but 30, 40, or 50 years ago of an ephemeral character. Historical and theological books are very rare. Novels and poetry of that period are absolutely not to be found. Medical and law books are more common. I am bound to say that in no country have more books been printed and more destroyed than in Holland. W. Muller. The policy of buying up all objectionable literature seems to me, I confess, very short-sighted, and in most cases would lead to a greatly increased reprint. It certainly would in these latitudes. From the Church of Rome to the Church of England is no great leap, and Mr. Smith, the Brighton bookseller, gives evidence thus: "It may be worth your while to note that the clergy of the last 2 centuries ought to be included in your list of biblioclasts. I have had painful experience of the fact in the following manner. Numbers of volumes in their libraries have had a few leaves removed, and in many others whole sections torn out. I suppose it served their purpose thus to use the wisdom of greater men, and that they thus economized their own time by tearing out portions to suit their purpose. The hardship to the trade is this: their books are purchased in good faith as perfect, and when resold the buyer is quick to claim damage if found defective, while the seller has no redress. Among the careless destroyers of books still at work should be classed government officials. Cartloads of interesting documents, bound and unbound, have been sold at various times as waste paper, when modern red tape thought them but rubbish. Some of them have been rescued and resold at high prices, but some have been lost forever. Note: Nell Gwyn's private housekeeping book was among them, containing most curious particulars of what was necessary in the time of Charles I for a princely household. Fortunately, it was among the rescued, and is now in a private library. End note. In 1854, a very interesting series of blue books was commenced by the authorities of the Patent Office, of course paid for out of the national purse. Beginning with the year 1617, the particulars of every important patent were printed from the original specifications, and facsimile drawings made where necessary for the elucidation of the text. A very moderate price was charged for each, only indeed the prime cost of production. The general public, of course, cared little for such literature, but those interested in the origin and progress of any particular art cared much, and many sets of patents were purchased by those engaged in research. But the great bulk of the stock was to some extent inconvenient, and so when a removal to other offices in 1879 became necessary, the question arose as to what could be done with them. These blue books, which had cost the nation many thousands of pounds, were positively sold to the paper mills as waste paper, and nearly 100 tons weight were carted away at about £3 per ton. It is difficult to believe, though positively true, that so great an act of vandalism could have been perpetrated even in a government office. It is true that no demand existed for some of them, but it is equally true that in numerous cases, especially in the early specifications of the steam engine and the printing machine, the want of them has caused great disappointment. To add a climax to the story, many of the pulped specifications have had to be reprinted more than once since their destruction. End of Chapter 5. Recording by Maria Kasper. Chapter 6 of The Enemies of Books by William Blades. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. The Bookworm. There is a sort of busy worm that will the fairest books deform, by gnawing holes throughout them. Alike through every leaf they go, yet of its merits naught they know, nor care they aught about them. Their tasteless tooth will tear and taint the poet, patriot, sage, or saint, not sparing wit nor learning. Now if you'd know the reason why, the best of reasons I'll apply. 'Tis bread to the poor vermin. Of pepper, snuff, or bacca smoke, and Russia calf they make a joke. Yet why should sons of science these puny, rankling reptiles dread? 'Tis but to let their books be read, and bid the worms defiance. J. Doraston. A most destructive enemy of books has been the bookworm. I say has been,
because fortunately his ravages in all civilized countries have been greatly restricted during the last 50 years. This is due partly to the increased reverence for antiquity which has been universally developed, more still to the feeling of cupidity which has caused all owners to take care of volumes which year by year have become more valuable, and to some considerable extent due to the falling off in the production of edible books. The monks, who were the chief makers as well as the custodians of books, through the long ages we call dark because so little is known of them, had no fear of the bookworm before their eyes, for, ravenous as he is and was, he loves not parchment, and at that time paper was not. Whether at a still earlier period he attacked the papyrus, the paper of the Egyptians, I know not. Probably he did, as it was a purely vegetable substance, and if so, it is quite possible that the worm of today, in such evil repute with us, is the lineal descendant of ravenous ancestors who plagued the sacred priests of On in the time of Joseph's Pharaoh by destroying their title deeds and their books of science. Rare things and precious as manuscripts were before the invention of typography, are well preserved, but when the printing press was invented and paper books were multiplied in the earth, when libraries increased and readers were many, then familiarity bred contempt. Books were packed in out-of-the-way places and neglected, and the oft-quoted, though seldom seen, bookworm became an acknowledged tenant of the library and the mortal enemy of the bibliophile. Anathemas have been hurled against this pest in nearly every European language, old and new, and classical scholars of bygone centuries have thrown their spondees and dactyls at him. Pierre Petit in 1683 devoted a long Latin poem to his dispraise, and Parnell's charming ode is well known. Here the poet lament, "Pene tu mihi passerum Catuli, pene tu mihi lesbiam abstulisti," and then, "Quid dicam in numeros bene eruditos, quorum tu monumenta tu labores, isti pessimo ventre devorasti?" While Petit, who was evidently moved by strong personal feelings against the invisum pecus, as he calls him, addresses his little enemy as bestia audax and pestus chartarum. But as a portrait commonly precedes a biography, the curious reader may wish to be told what this bestia audax, who so greatly ruffles the tempers of our eclectics, is like. Here, at starting, is a serious chameleon-like difficulty, for the bookworm offers to us, if we are guided by their words, as many varieties of size and shape as there are beholders. Sylvester, in his Laws of Verse, with more words than wit, described him as a microscopic creature wriggling on the learned page, which, when discovered, stiffens out into the resemblance of a streak of dirt. The earliest notice is in Micrographia by R. Hooke, folio, London, 1665. This work, which was printed at the expense of the Royal Society of London, is an account of innumerable things examined by the author under the microscope, and is most interesting for the frequent accuracy of the author's observations, and most amusing for his equally frequent blunders. In his account of the bookworm, his remarks, which are rather long and very minute, are absurdly blundering. He calls it a small white silver-shining worm or moth, which I found much conversant among books and papers, and is supposed to be that which corrodes and eats holes through the leaves and covers. Its head appears big and blunt, and its body tapers from it towards the tail, smaller and smaller, being shaped almost like a carrot. It has 2 long horns before, which are straight and tapering towards the top, curiously ringed or knobbed and bristled, much like the marshweed called horse's tail. The hinder part is terminated with 3 tails, in every particular resembling the 2 longer horns that grow out of the head. The legs are scaled and haired. This animal probably feeds upon the paper and covers of books, and perforates in them several small round holes, finding perhaps a convenient nourishment in those husks of hemp and flax which have passed through so many scourings, washings, dressings, and dryings as the parts of old paper necessarily have suffered. And indeed, when I consider what a heap of sawdust or chips this little creature, which is one of the teeth of time, conveys into its entrails, I cannot choose but remember and admire the excellent contrivance of nature in placing in animals such a fire as is continually nourished and supplied by the materials conveyed into the stomach and fomented by the bellows of the lungs. The picture or image which accompanies this description is wonderful to behold. Certainly our Hook, Fellow of the Royal Society, drew somewhat upon his imagination here, having apparently evolved both the engraving and description from his inner consciousness. Note: not so. Several correspondents have drawn my attention to the fact that Hook is evidently describing the lepisma, which, if not positively injurious, is often found in the warm places of old houses, especially if a little damp. He mistook this for the bookworm. End note. Entomologists even do not appear to have paid much attention to the natural history of the worm. Kirby, speaking of it, says, "The larva of Crambus pinguinalis spins a robe which it covers with its own excrement and does no little injury." Again, "I have often observed the caterpillar of a little moth that takes its station in damp old books, and there commits great ravages, and many a black-letter rarity, which in these days of bibliomania would have been valued at its weight in gold, has been snatched by these devastators," etc., etc. As already quoted, Doraston's description is very vague. To him he is in one verse a sort of busy worm, and in another a puny rankling reptile. Hannett, in his work on bookbinding, gives Aglossa pinguinalis as the real name, and Mrs. Gatty, in her parables, christens it Hypothenimus cruditus. The Reverend F.T. Havergal, who many years ago had much trouble with bookworms in the Cathedral Library of Hereford, says they are a kind of death watch, with a hard outer skin, and are dark brown, another sort having white bodies with brown spots on their heads. Mr. Hulme, in Notes and Queries for 1870, states that the Anobium paniceum has done considerable injury to the Arabic manuscripts brought from Cairo by Burckhardt, and now in the University Library, Cambridge. Other writers say Acarus eruditus or Anobium pertinax are the correct scientific names. Personally, I have come across but few specimens. Nevertheless, from what I have been told by librarians, and judging from analogy, I imagine the following to be about the truth. There are several kinds of caterpillar and grub which eat into books. Those with legs are the larvae of moths. Those without legs, or rather with rudimentary legs, are grubs and turn into beetles. It is not known whether any species of caterpillar or grub can live generation after generation upon books alone. But several sorts of wood borers and others which live upon vegetable refuse will attack paper, especially if attracted in the first place by the real wooden boards in which it was the custom of the old bookbinders to clothe their volumes. In this belief, some country librarians object to opening the library windows, lest the enemy should fly in from the neighboring woods and rear a brood of worms. Anyone, indeed, who has seen a hole in a filbert or a piece of wood riddled by dry rot will recognize a similarity of appearance in the channels made by these insect enemies. Among the paper-eating species are 1. The Anobium. Of this beetle there are varieties, namely Anobium pertinax, Anobium eruditus, and Anobium paniceum. In the larval state they are grubs, just like those found in nuts. and in this stage they are too much alike to be distinguished from one another. They feed on old dry wood, and often infest bookcases and shelves. They eat the wooden boards of old books, and so pass into the paper, where they make long holes, quite round, except when they work in a slanting direction, when the holes appear to be oblong. They will thus pierce through several volumes in succession. Pignot, the well-known bibliographer, having found 27 volumes so pierced in a straight line by one worm, a miracle of gluttony, the story of which, for myself, I receive cum grano salis. After a certain time the larva changes into a pupa, and then emerges as a small brown beetle. 2. Oecophora. This larva is similar in size to that of Anobium, but can be distinguished at once by having legs. It is a caterpillar, with 6 legs upon its thorax, and 8 sucker-like protuberances on its body, like a silkworm. It changes into a chrysalis, and then assumes its perfect shape as a small brown moth. The species that attacks books is the Oecophora pseudospretella. It loves damp and warmth, and eats any fibrous material. This caterpillar is quite unlike any garden species, and, excepting the legs, is very similar in appearance and size to the Anobium. It is about a half-inch long, with a horny head and strong jaws. To printer's ink or writing ink he appears to have no great dislike, though I imagine that the former often disagrees with his health, unless he is very robust, as in books where the print is pierced, a majority of the wormholes I have seen are too short in extent to have provided food enough for the development of the grub. But although the ink may be unwholesome, many grubs survive, and eating day and night in silence and darkness, work out their destiny, leaving, according to the strength of their constitutions, a longer or shorter tunnel in the volume. In December 1879, Mr. Birdsall, a well-known bookbinder of Northampton, kindly sent me by post a fat little worm, which had been found by one of his workmen in an old book while being bound. He bore his journey extremely well, being very lively when turned out. I placed him in a box, in warmth and quiet, with some small fragments of paper from a Boethius printed by Caxton, and a leaf of a 17th century book. He ate a small piece of the leaf, but either from too much fresh air, from unaccustomed liberty, or from a change of food, he gradually weakened and died in about 3 weeks. I was sorry to lose him, as I wished to verify his name in his perfect state. Mr. Waterhouse, of the Entomological Department of the British Museum, very kindly examined him before death, and was of the opinion he was Oecophora pseudospretella. In July 1885, Dr. Garnett of the British Museum gave me 2 worms which had been found in an old Hebrew commentary just received from Athens. They had doubtless had a good shaking on their journey, and one was moribund when I took charge, and joined his defunct kindred in a few days. The other seemed hearty, and lived with me for nearly 18 months. I treated him as well as I knew how, placed him in a small box, with a choice of 3 sorts of old paper to eat, and very seldom disturbed him. He evidently resented his confinement, ate very little, moved very little, and changed in appearance very little, even when dead. This Greek worm, filled with Hebrew lore, differed in many respects from any other I have seen. He was longer, thinner, and more delicate-looking than any of his English congeners. He was transparent, like thin ivory, and had a dark line through his body, which I took to be his intestinal canal. He resigned his life with extreme procrastination, and died deeply lamented by his keeper, who had long looked forward to his final development. The difficulty of breeding these worms is probably due to their formation. When in a state of nature, they can by expansion and contraction of the body, working upon the sides of their holes, push their horny jaws against the opposing mass of paper. But when freed from that restraint, which indeed to them is life, they cannot eat, although surrounded with food, for they have no legs to keep them steady, and their natural leverage is wanting. Considering the numerous old books contained in the British Museum, the library there is wonderfully free from the worm. Mr. Rye, lately the keeper of the printed books there, writes me 2 or 3 were discovered in my time, but they were weakly creatures. One, I remember, was conveyed into the Natural History Department, and was taken into custody by Mr. Adam White, who pronounced it to be Anobium pertinax. I never heard of it after. The reader who has not had an opportunity of examining old libraries can have no idea of the dreadful havoc which these pests are capable of making. I have now before me a very fine folio volume, printed on very good unbleached paper, as thick as stout cartridge, in the year 1477, by Peter Schoeffer of Mentz. Unfortunately, after a period of neglect in which it suffered severely from the worm, it was about 50 years ago considered worth a new cover, and so again suffered severely, this time at the hands of the binder. Thus the original state of the boards is unknown, but the damage done to the leaves can be accurately described. The worms have attacked each end. On the first leaf are 212 distinct holes, varying in size from a common pinhole to that which a stout knitting needle would make, say 1/16 to 1/23 of an inch. These holes run mostly in lines more or less at right angles with the covers, a very few being channels along the paper affecting 3 or 4 sheets only. The varied energy of these little pests is thus represented. On folio 1 are 212 holes, on folio 11 are 57 holes, on folio 21 are 48 holes, on folio 31 are 31 holes, on folio 41 are 18 holes, on folio 51 are 6 holes, on folio 61 are 4 holes, on folio 71 are 2 holes, on folio 81 are 2 holes, on folio 87 is 1 hole, on folio 90 are no holes. These 90 leaves, being stout, are about the thickness of 1 inch. The volume has 250 leaves, and turning to the end, we find on the last leaf 81 holes, made by a breed of worms not so ravenous. Thus, from the end, on folio 1 are 81 holes, on folio 11 are 40 holes. From the other end, on folio 66 is 1 hole, on folio 69 are no holes. It is curious to notice how the holes, rapidly at first and then slowly and more slowly, disappear. You trace the same hole, leaf after leaf, until suddenly the size becomes in one leaf reduced to half its normal diameter, and a close examination will show a small abrasion on the paper in the next leaf, exactly where the hole would have come if continued. In the book quoted, it is just as if there had been a race. In the first 10 leaves, the weak worms are left behind. In the second 10, there are still 48 eaters. These are reduced to 31 in the third 10, and to only 18 in the fourth 10. On folio 51, only 6 worms hold on, and before folio 61, 2 of them have given in. Before reaching folio 7, it is a neck-and-neck race between 2 sturdy gourmands, each making a fine large hole, one of them being oval in shape. At folio 71, they are still neck-and-neck, and at folio 81 the same. At folio 87, the oval worm gives in, the round one eating 3 more leaves and partway through the 4th. The leaves of the book are then untouched until we reach the 69th from the end, upon which is 1 wormhole. After this they go on multiplying to the end of the book. I have quoted this instance because I have it handy. but many worms eat much longer holes than any in this volume. Some I have seen running quite through a couple of thick volumes, covers and all. In the Schoeffer book, the holes are probably the work of Anobium pertinax, because the center is spared and both ends are attacked. Originally, real wooden boards were the covers for this volume, and here, doubtless, the attack was commenced, which was carried through each board into the paper of the book. I well remember my first visit to the Bodleian Library in the year 1858, Dr. Bandinel being then the librarian. He was very kind, and afforded me every facility for examining the fine collection of Caxtons, which was the object of my journey. In looking over a parcel of black-letter fragments, which had been in the drawer for a long time, I came across a small grub, which, without a thought, I threw on the floor and trod underfoot. Soon after I found another, a fat, glossy fellow, so long, which I carefully preserved in a little paper box, intending to observe his habits and development. Seeing Dr. Bandinel near, I asked him to look at my curiosity. Hardly, however, had I turned the wriggling little victim out upon the leather-covered table, when down came the doctor's great thumbnail upon him, and an inch-long smear proved the tomb of all my hopes, while the great bibliographer, wiping his thumb on his coat-sleeve, passed on with the remark, "Oh yes, they have black heads sometimes." That was something to know, another fact for the entomologist, for my little gentleman had a hard, shiny white head, and I had never heard of a black-headed bookworm before or since. Perhaps the great abundance of black-letter books in the Bodleian may account for the variety. At any rate, he was an Anobium. I have been unmercifully chaffed for the absurd idea that a paper-eating worm could be kept a prisoner in a paper box. Oh, these critics! Your bookworm is a shy, lazy beast, and takes a day or two to recover his appetite after being evicted. Moreover, he knew his own dignity better than to eat the loaded, glazed, shoddy notepaper in which he was incarcerated. In the case of Caxton's Life of Our Lady, already referred to, not only are there numerous small holes, but some very large channels at the bottom of the pages. This is a most unusual occurrence, and is probably the work of the larva of Dermestes vulpinus, a garden beetle which is very voracious and eats any kind of dry, ligneous rubbish. The scarcity of edible books in the present century has been mentioned. One result of the extensive adulteration of modern paper is that the worm will not touch it. His instinct forbids him to eat the china clay, the bleaches, the plaster of Paris, the sulphate of barytes, the scores of adulterants now used to mix with the fibre, and so far the wise pages of the old literature are, in the race against time with the modern rubbish, heavily handicapped. Thanks to the general interest taken in old books nowadays, the worm has a hard time of it, and but slight chance of that quiet neglect which is necessary to his existence. So much greater is the reason why some patient entomologist should, while there is the chance, take upon himself to study the habits of the creature, as Sir John Lubbock has those of the ant. I have now before me some leaves of a book, which, being waste, were used by our economical first printer, Caxton, to make boards, by pasting them together. Whether the old paste was an attraction, or whatever the reason may have been, the worm, when he got in there, did not, as usual, eat straight through everything into the middle of the book, but worked his way longitudinally, eating great furrows along the leaves, without passing out of the binding, and so furrowed are these few leaves by long channels that it is difficult to raise one of them without its falling to pieces. This is bad enough, but we may be very thankful that in these temperate climes we have no enemies such as are found in very hot countries, where a whole library, books, bookshelves, tables, chairs, and all may be destroyed in one night by a countless army of ants. Our cousins in the United States, so fortunate in many things, seem very fortunate in this, Their books are not attacked by the worm. At any rate, American writers say so. True it is that all their black letter comes from Europe, and having cost many dollars is well looked after. But there they have thousands of 17th and 18th century books in Roman type, printed in the States on genuine and wholesome paper, and the worm is not particular, at least in this country, about the type he eats through if the paper is good. Probably, therefore, the custodians of their old libraries could tell a different tale, which makes it all the more amusing to find in the excellent Encyclopedia of Printing, edited and printed by Ringwalt at Philadelphia, not only that the bookworm is a stranger there, for personally he is unknown to most of us, but that his slightest ravages are looked upon as both curious and rare. After quoting Dibdin, with the addition of a few flights of imagination of his own, Ringwalt states that this paper-eating moth is supposed to have been introduced into England in hog's leather binding from Holland. He then ends with what, to anyone who has seen the ravages of the worm in hundreds of books, must be charming in its native simplicity. There is now, he states, evidently quoting this as a great curiosity, there is now in a private library in Philadelphia a book perforated by this insect. O lucky Philadelphians, who can boast of possessing the oldest library in the States, but must ask leave of a private collector if they wish to see the one wormhole in the whole city. End of Chapter 6. Recording by Maria Kasper. Chapter 7 of The Enemies of Books by William Blades. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Other Vermin. Besides the worm, I do not think there is any insect enemy of books worth description. The domestic black beetle, or cockroach, is far too modern an introduction to our country to have done much harm, though he will sometimes nibble the binding of books, especially if they rest upon the floor. Not so fortunate, however, are our American cousins, for in the Library Journal of September 1879, Mr. Weston Flint gives an account of a dreadful little pest which commits great havoc upon the cloth bindings of the New York libraries. It is a small black beetle or cockroach called by scientists Blatta germanica, and by others the croton bug. Unlike our household pest, whose home is the kitchen, and whose bashfulness loves secrecy and the dark hours, this misgrown flat species, of which it would take two to make a medium-sized English specimen, has gained in impudence what it has lost in size, fearing neither light nor noise, neither man nor beast. In the Old English Bible of 1551, we read in Psalm 91, verse 5, "Thou shalt not need to be afraid for any bugs by night." This verse falls unheeded on the ear of the Western librarian who fears his bugs both night and day, for they crawl over everything in broad sunlight, infesting and infecting each corner and cranny of the bookshelves they choose as their home. There is a remedy in the powder known as insecticide, which, however, is very disagreeable upon books and shelves. It is, nevertheless, very fatal to these pests, and affords some consolation in the fact that so soon as a bug shows any signs of illness, he is devoured at once by his voracious brethren, with the same relish as if he were made of fresh paste. There is, too, a small silvery insect, Lepisma, which I have often seen in the backs of neglected books, but his ravages are not of much importance. Nor can we reckon the codfish as very dangerous to literature, unless indeed he be of the Roman obedience, like that wonderful ichthyobibliophage, pardon me, Professor Owen, who in the year 1626 swallowed 3 puritanical treatises of John Frith, the Protestant martyr. No wonder after such a meal he was soon caught, and became famous in the annals of literature. The following is the title of a little book issued upon the occasion:
Vox Pisces, or The Book Fish, containing 3 treatises which were found in the belly of a codfish in Cambridge Market on Midsummer Eve, A.D. 1626. Lowndes says, see under Tracy, "Great was the consternation at Cambridge upon the publication of this work." Rats and mice, however, are occasionally very destructive, as the following anecdote will show. 2 centuries ago, the library of the Dean and Chapter of Westminster was kept in the Chapter House, and repairs having become necessary in that building, a scaffolding was erected inside, the books being left on their shelves. One of the holes made in the wall for a scaffold pole was selected by a pair of rats for their family residence. Here they formed a nest for their young ones by descending to the library shelves and biting away the leaves of various books. Snug and comfortable was their little household, until one day the builders' men having finished, the poles were removed, and, alas for the rats, the hole was closed up with bricks and cement. Buried alive, the father and mother, with 5 or 6 of their offspring, met with a speedy death. And not until a few years ago, when a restoration of the Chapter House was effected, was this rat grave opened again for a scaffold pole, and all their skeletons and their nest discovered. Their bones and the paper fragments of their nest may now be seen in a glass case in the Chapter House, some of the fragments being attributed to books from the press of Caxton. This is not the case, although there are pieces of very early black-letter books, not now to be found in the Abbey Library, including little bits of the famous Queen Elizabeth's Prayer Book with woodcuts, 1568. A friend sends me the following incident. A few years since, some rats made nests in the trees surrounding my house. From thence they jumped on to some flat roofing, and so made their way down a chimney into a room where I kept books. A number of these, with parchment backs, they entirely destroyed, as well as some 6 books whole-bound in parchment. Another friend informs me that in the Natural History Museum of the Devon and Exeter Institution there is a specimen of another little pest which has a great affection for bindings in calf and roan. Its scientific name is Nyptus hololeucus. He adds, "Are you aware that there was a terrible creature allied to these, rejoicing in the name of Tomicus typographus, which committed sad ravages in Germany in the 17th century, and in the old liturgies of that country is formally mentioned under its vulgar name, the Turk." See Kirby and Spence, 7th edition, 1858, page 123. This is curious, and I did not know it, although I did know well that Typographus Tomicus, or the cutting printer, is a sad enemy of good books. Upon this part of our subject, however, I am debarred entering. The following is from W. J. Westbrook, Doctor of Music, Cambridge, and represents ravages with which I am personally unacquainted. Dear Blades, I send you an example of the enemymosity of an ordinary housefly. It hid behind the paper, emitted some caustic fluid, and then departed this life. I have often caught them in such holes. December 30th, 1883. The damage is an oblong hole surrounded by a white fluffy glaze, fungoid, difficult to represent in a woodcut. The size here given is exact. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Maria Kasper. Chapter 8 of The Enemies of Books by William Blades. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Bookbinders. In the first chapter I mentioned bookbinders among the enemies of books, and I tremble to think what a stinging retort might be made if some irate bibliopagist were to turn the scales on the printer and place him in the same category. On the sins of printers, and the unnatural neglect which has often shortened the lives of their typographical progeny, it is not for me to dilate. There is an old proverb, "'Tis an ill bird that befouls its own nest." A curious chapter thereupon, with many written examples, might nevertheless be written. This I will leave, and will now only place on record some of the cruelties perpetrated upon books by the ignorance or carelessness of binders. Like men, books have a soul and a body. With the soul, or the literary portion, we have nothing to do at present. The body, which is the outer frame or covering, and without which the inner would be unusable, is the special work of the binder. He, so to speak, begets it. He determines its form and adornment. He doctors it in disease and decay, and, not unseldom, dissects it after death. Here, too, as through all nature, we find the good and bad running side by side. What a treat it is to handle a well-bound volume! The leaves lie open fully and freely, as if tempting you to read on, and you handle them without fear of their parting from the back. To look at the tooling, too, is a pleasure, for careful thought, combined with artistic skill, is everywhere apparent. You open the cover and find the same loving attention inside that has been given to the outside, all the workmanship being true and thorough. Indeed, so conservative is a good binding that many a worthless book has had an honored old age simply out of respect to its outward aspect, and many a real treasure has come to a degraded end and premature death through the unsightliness of its outward case and the irreparable damage done to it in binding. The weapon with which the binder deals the most deadly blows to books is the plough, the effect of which is to cut away the margins, placing the print in a false position relatively to the back and head, and often denuding the work of portions of the very text. This reduction in size not seldom brings a handsome folio to the size of a quarto, and a quarto to an octavo. With the old hand plough, a binder required more care and caution to produce an even edge throughout than with the new cutting machine. If a careless workman found that he had not ploughed the margin quite square with the text, he would put it in his press and take off another shaving, sometimes even a third. Dante, in his Inferno, deals out to the lost souls various tortures suited with dramatic fitness to the past crimes of the victims, and had I to execute judgment on the criminal binders of certain precious volumes I have seen, where the untouched maiden sheets entrusted to their care have, by barbarous treatment, lost dignity, beauty, and value, I would collect the paper shavings so ruthlessly shorn off, and roast the perpetrator of the outrage over their slow combustion. In olden times, before men had learned to value the relics of our printers, there was some excuse for the sins of a binder who erred from ignorance, which was general. But in these times, when the historical and antiquarian value of old books is freely acknowledged, no quarter should be granted to a careless culprit. It may be supposed that from the spread of information all real danger from ignorance is past. Not so, good reader. That is a consummation as yet devoutly to be wished. Let me relate to you a true bibliographical anecdote. In 1877, a certain lord, who had succeeded to a fine collection of old books, promised to send some of the most valuable, among which were several Caxtons, to the exhibition at South Kensington. Thinking their outward appearance too shabby, and not knowing the danger of his conduct, he decided to have them rebound in the neighboring county town. The volumes were soon returned, in a resplendent state, and it is said, quite to the satisfaction of his lordship, whose pleasure, however, was sadly dampened when a friend pointed out to him that although the discolored edges had all been ploughed off, and the time-stained blanks with their 15th century autographs had been replaced by nice clean fly-leaves, yet, looking at the result in its lowest aspect only, that of market value, the books had been damaged to at least the amount of £500, and, moreover, that caustic remarks would most certainly follow upon their public exhibition. Those poor injured volumes were never sent. Some years ago, one of the most rare books printed by Maclinia, a thin folio, was discovered bound in sheep by a country bookbinder and cut down to suit the size of some quarto tracts. But do not let us suppose that country binders are the only culprits. It is not very long since the discovery of a unique Caxton in one of our largest London libraries. It was in boards, as originally issued by the 15th century binder, and a great fuss, very properly, was made over the treasure trove. Of course, cries the reader, it was kept in its original covers, with all the interesting associations of its early state untouched. No such thing. Instead of making a suitable case in which it could be preserved just as it was placed in the hands of a well-known London binder, with the order whole bind in velvet. He did his best, and the volume now glows luxuriously in its gilt edges and its inappropriate covering, and, alas, with a half-inch of its uncut margin taken off all around. How do I know that? Because the clever binder, seeing some manuscript remarks on one of the margins, turned that leaf down to avoid cutting them off. And that stern witness will always testify to the observant reader the original size of the book. This same binder, on another occasion, placed a unique 15th century indulgence in warm water to separate it from the cover upon which it was pasted, the result being that, when dry, it was so distorted as to be useless. That man soon after passed to another world, where we may hope his works have not followed him, and that his merits as a good citizen and an honest man counterbalanced his demerits as a binder. Other similar instances will occur to the memory of many a reader, and doubtless the same sin will be committed from time to time by certain binders, who seem to have an ingrained antipathy to rough edges and large margins, which, of course, are, in their view, made by nature as food for the shavings tub. De Rome, a celebrated bookbinder of the 18th century, who was nicknamed by Dibdin the Great Cropper, was, although in private life an estimable man, much addicted to the vice of reducing the margins of all the books sent to him to bind. So far did he go that he even spared not a fine copy of Froissart's Chronicles, on vellum, in which was the autograph of the well-known book-lover de Thou, but cropped it most cruelly. Owners, too, have occasionally diseased minds with regard to margins. A friend writes, "Your amusing anecdotes have brought to my memory several biblioclasts whom I have known. One roughly cut the margins off his books with a knife, hacking away very much like a hedger and ditcher. Large paper volumes were his especial delight, as they gave more paper. The slips thus obtained were used for index making. Another, with the bump of order unnaturally developed, had his folios and quartos all reduced in binding to one size, so that they might look even on his bookshelves. This latter was doubtless cousin to him who deliberately cut down all his books close to the text, because he had several times been annoyed by readers who made marginal notes. The indignities, too, suffered by some books in their lettering. Fancy an early black-letter 15th century quarto on knighthood, labeled Tracts, or a translation of Virgil, Sermons. The Histories of Troy, printed by Caxton, still exists with Heracles on the back as its title, because that name occurs several times in the early chapters, and the binder was too proud to seek advice. The words miscellaneous or old pieces were sometimes used when binders were at a loss for the lettering, and many other instances might be mentioned. The rapid spread of printing throughout Europe in the latter part of the 15th century caused a great fall in the value of plain, unilluminated manuscripts, and the immediate consequence of this was the destruction of numerous volumes written upon parchment, which were used by the binders to strengthen the backs of their newly printed rivals. These slips of vellum or parchment are quite common in old books. Sometimes whole sheets are used as fly-leaves, and often reveal the existence of most valuable works unknown before, proving at the same time the small value formerly attached to them. Many a bibliographer, while examining old books, has to his great puzzlement come across short slips of parchment, nearly always from some old manuscript, sticking out like guards from the midst of the leaves. These suggest, at first, imperfections or damage done to the volume, but if examined closely, it will be found that they are always in the middle of a paper section, and the real reason of their existence is just the same as when 2 leaves of parchment occur here and there in a paper volume, namely strength to resist the lug which the strong thread makes against the middle of each section. These slips represent old books destroyed, and like the slips already noticed, should always be carefully examined. When valuable books have been evil entreated, when they have become soiled by dirty hands, or spoiled by water stains, or injured by grease spots, nothing is more astonishing to the uninitiated than the transformation they undergo in the hands of a skillful restorer. The covers are first carefully dissected, the eye of the operator keeping a careful outlook for any fragments of old manuscripts or early printed books, which may have been used by the original binder. No force should be applied to separate parts which adhere together. A little warm water and care is sure to overcome that difficulty. When all the sections are loose, the separate sheets are placed singly in a bath of cold water, and allowed to remain there until all the dirt has soaked out. If not sufficiently purified, a little hydrochloric or oxalic acid or caustic potash may be put in the water, according as the stains are from grease or from ink. Here is where an unpracticed binder will probably injure the book for life. If the chemicals are too strong, or the sheets remain too long in the bath, or are not thoroughly cleansed from the bleach before they are resized, the certain seeds of decay are planted in the paper, and although for a time the leaves may look bright to the eye and even crackle under the hand like the soundest paper, yet in the course of a few years the enemy will appear, the fiber will decay, and the existence of the books will terminate in a state of white tinder. Everything which diminishes the interest of a book is inimical to its preservation, and in fact is its enemy. Therefore, a few words upon the destruction of old bindings. I remember purchasing, many years ago, at a suburban bookstall, a perfect copy of Moxon's Mechanic Exercises, now a scarce work. The volumes were uncut, and had the original marble covers. They looked so attractive in their old-fashioned dress that I at once determined to preserve it. My binder soon made for them a neat wooden box in the shape of a book, with morocco back properly lettered, where I trust the originals will be preserved from dust and injury for many a long year. Old covers, whether boards or paper, should always be retained if in any state approaching decency. A case, which can be embellished to any extent, looks every whit as well upon the shelf, and gives even greater protection than binding. It also has this great advantage: it does not deprive your descendants of the opportunity of seeing for themselves exactly in what dress the book buyers of 4 centuries ago received their volumes. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Maria Kasper. Chapter 9 of The Enemies of Books by William Blades. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Collectors. After all, 2-legged depredators, who ought to have known better, have perhaps done as much real damage in libraries as any other enemy. I do not refer to thieves, who, if they injure the owners, do no harm to the books themselves by merely transferring them from one set of bookshelves to another. Nor do I refer to certain readers who frequent our public libraries, and to save themselves the trouble of copying, will cut out whole articles from magazines or encyclopedias. Such depredations are not frequent, and only occur with books easily replaced, and do not therefore call for more than a passing mention. But it is a serious matter when nature produces such a wicked old biblioclast as John Bagford, one of the founders of the Society of Antiquaries, who, in the beginning of the last century, went about the country, from library to library, tearing away title pages from rare books of all sizes. These he sorted out into nationalities and towns,
and so, with a lot of handbills, manuscript notes, and miscellaneous collections of all kinds, formed over 100 folio volumes now preserved in the British Museum. That they are of service as materials in compiling a general history of printing cannot be denied, but the destruction of many rare books was the result, and more than counterbalanced any benefit bibliographers will ever receive from them. When here and there throughout those volumes you meet with titles of books now either unknown entirely or of the greatest rarity, when you find the colophon from the end, or the insignia typography from the first leaf of a rare 15er, pasted down with dozens of others varying in value, you cannot bless the memory of the antiquarian shoemaker John Bagford. His portrait, a half-length, painted by Howard, was engraved by Virtue, and re-engraved for this bibliographical Decameron. A bad example often finds imitators, and every season there crop up for sale one or two such collections, formed by bibliomaniacs, who, although calling themselves bibliophiles, ought really to be ranked among the worst enemies of books. The following is copied from a trade catalogue dated April 1880, and affords a fair idea of the extent to which these heartless destroyers will go. Missal illuminations. 50 different capital letters on vellum, all in rich gold and colors, many 3 inches square. The floral decorations are of great beauty, ranging from the 12th to the 15th century, mounted on stout cardboard, in nice preservation, £6 6s. These beautiful letters have been cut from precious manuscripts, and as specimens of early art are extremely valuable, many of them being worth 15 shillings each. Mr. Proem is a man well known to the London dealers in old books. He is wealthy, and cares not what he spends to carry out his bibliographical craze, which is the collection of title pages. These he ruthlessly extracts, frequently leaving the decapitated carcass of the books, for which he cares not, behind him. Unlike the destroyer Bagford, he has no useful object in view, but simply follows a senseless kind of classification. For instance, one set of volumes contains nothing but copperplate engraved titles, and woe betide the grand old Dutch folios of the 17th century if they cross his path. Another is a volume of coarse or quaint titles, which certainly answer the end of showing how idiotic and conceited some authors have been. Here you find Dr. Sibb's Bowels Opened in Diverse Sermons, 1650, cheek by jowl with the discourse attributed falsely to Huntington the Calvinist, Die and be damned, with many others too coarse to be quoted. The odd titles adopted for his poems by Taylor the water poet enliven several pages, and make one's mouth water for the books themselves. A third volume includes only such titles as have the printer's device. If you shut your eyes to the injury done by such collectors, you may, to a certain extent, enjoy the collection, for there is great beauty in some titles. But such a pursuit is neither useful nor meritorious. By and by the end comes, and then dispersion follows collection, and the volumes, which probably cost £200 each in their formation, will be knocked down to a dealer for £10, finally gravitating into the South Kensington Library or some public museum as a bibliographical curiosity. The following has just been sold, July 1880, by Messrs. Sotheby, Wilkinson and Hodge, in the Dun Gardinier collection, lot 1592, title pages and frontispieces, a collection of upwards of 800 engraved titles and frontispieces, English and foreign, some very fine and curious, taken from old books, and neatly mounted on cartridge paper in 3 volumes, half morocco, gilt, impressed folio. The only collection of title pages which has afforded me unalloyed pleasure
is a handsome folio published by the directors of the Plantin Museum, Antwerp, in 1877, just after the purchase of that wonderful typographical storehouse. It is called Titels en Portretten gesneden naar P. Rubens voor de Plantinsche Drukkerij, and it contains 35 grand title pages reprinted from the original 17th century plates, designed by Rubens himself between the years 1612 and 1640, for various publications which issued from the celebrated Plantin printing office. In the same museum are preserved in Rubens' own handwriting his charge for each design, duly receipted at foot. I have now before me a fine copy of Conclusions sur Décisions Antiques d'Honneur de Rota, printed by Gutenberg's partner Schoeffler in the year 1477. It is perfect except in a most vital part, the colophon, which has been cut out by some barbaric collector, and which should read thus: Pridie nonis Januarie 1477, in civitate Morguntina, impressori Petrus Schäufer de Gernsheim, followed by his well-known mark, 2 shields. A similar mania arose at the beginning of this century for collections of illuminated initials, which were taken from manuscripts and arranged on the pages of a blank book in alphabetical order. Some of our cathedral libraries suffered severely from depredations of this kind. At Lincoln, in the early part of this century, the boys put on their robes in the library, a room close to the choir. Here were numerous old manuscripts and 8 or 10 rare caxtons. The choir boys used often to amuse themselves while waiting for the signal to fall in by cutting out with their penknives the illuminated initials in vignettes, which they would take into the choir with them and pass round from one to another. The dean and chapter of those days were not much better, for they let Dr. Dibdin have all their caxtons for a consideration. He made a little catalogue of them, which he called a Lincoln nosegay. Eventually they were absorbed into the collection of Althorp. The late Mr. Kaspari was a destroyer of books. His rare collection of early woodcuts, exhibited in 1877 at the Caxton celebration, has been frequently augmented by the purchase of illustrated books, the plates of which were taken out and mounted on Bristol boards to enrich his collection. He once showed me the remains of a fine copy of Thurdank, which he had served so, and I have now before me several of the leaves which he then gave me, and which, for beauty of engraving and cleverness of typography, surpasses any typographical work known to me. It was printed for the Emperor Maximilian by Hans Schonsberger of Nuremberg, and to make it unique, all the punches were cut on purpose, and as many as 7 or 8 varieties of each letter, which, together with the clever way in which the ornamental flourishes are carried above and below the line, has led even experienced printers to deny its being typography. It is nevertheless entirely from cast types. A copy in good condition costs about £50. Many years since I purchased at Messrs. Sotheby's a large lot of manuscript leaves on vellum, some being whole sections of a book, but mostly single leaves. Many were so mutilated by the excision of initials as to be worthless, but those with poor initials or with none were quite good, and when sorted out I found I had got large portions of nearly 20 different manuscripts, mostly Horae, showing 12 varieties of 15th century handwriting in Latin, French, Dutch, and German. I had each sort bound separately, and they now form an interesting collection. Portrait collectors have destroyed many books by abstracting the frontispiece to add to their treasures, and when once a book is made imperfect, its march to destruction is rapid. This is why books like Atkins's Origin and Growth of Printing, quarto 1664, have become impossible to get. When issued, Atkins's pamphlet had a fine frontispiece by Logan, containing portraits of King Charles II, attended by Archbishop Sheldon, the Duke of Albemarle, and the Earl of Clarendon. As portraits of these celebrities, excepting of course the King, are extremely rare, collectors have bought up this quarto tract of Atkins's whenever it has been offered, and torn away the frontispiece to adorn their collection. This is why, if you take up any sale catalogue of old books, you are certain to find here and there, appended to the description, wanting the title, or wanting 2 plates, or wanting the last page. It is quite common to find in old manuscripts, especially 15th century, both vellum and paper, the blank margins of the leaves cut away. This will be from the side edge or from the foot, and the recurrence of this mutilation puzzled me for many years. It arose from the scarcity of paper in former times, so that when a message had to be sent which required more exactitude than could be entrusted to the stupid memory of a household messenger, the master or chaplain went to the library, and, not having paper to use, took down an old book, and cut from its broad margins 1 or more slips to serve his present need. I feel quite inclined to reckon among enemies those bibliomaniacs and over-careful possessors who, being unable to carry their treasures into the next world, do all they can to hinder their usefulness in this. What a difficulty there is to obtain admission to the curious library of old Samuel Pepys, the well-known diarist. There it is at Magdalen College, Cambridge, in the identical bookcases provided for the books by Pepys himself. But no one can gain admission, except in the company of 2 fellows of the college, and if a single book be lost, the whole library goes away to a neighboring college. However willing and anxious to oblige, it is evident that no one can use the library at the expense of the time, if not temper, of 2 fellows. Some similar restrictions are in force at the Tellerian Museum, Haarlem, where a lifelong imprisonment is inflicted upon its many treasures. Some centuries ago, a valuable collection of books was left to the Guildford Endowed Grammar School. The schoolmaster was to be held personally responsible for the safety of every volume, which, if lost, he was bound to replace. I am told that one master, to minimize his risk as much as possible, took the following barbarous course. As soon as he was in possession, he raised the boards of the schoolroom floor, and having carefully packed all the books between the joists, had the boards nailed down again. Little reckoned he how many rats and mice made their nests there. He was bound to account some day for every single volume, and he saw no way so safe as rigid imprisonment. The late Sir Thomas Phillips of Middle Hill was a remarkable instance of a bibliotaph. He bought bibliographical treasures simply to bury them. His mansion was crammed with books. He purchased whole libraries, and never even saw what he had bought. Among some of his purchases was the first book printed in the English language, the Recoil of the Histories of Troy, translated and printed by William Caxton for the Duchess of Burgundy, sister to our Edward IV. It is true, though almost incredible, that Sir Thomas could never find this volume, although it doubtless is still in the collection, and no wonder, when cases of books bought 20 years before his death were never opened, and the only knowledge of their contents which he possessed was the sale catalogue or the bookseller's invoice. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Maria Kasper. Chapter 10 of The Enemies of Books by William Blades. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Servants and Children. Reader, are you married? Have you offspring? Boys especially, I mean, between, say, 6 and 12 years of age? Have you also a literary workshop supplied with choice tools, some for use, some for ornament, where you pass pleasant hours? And there's the rub, is there a special handmaid whose special duty it is to keep your den daily dusted and in order? Plead you guilty to these indictments? then I am sure of a sympathetic co-sufferer. Dust. It is all a delusion. It is not the dust that makes women anxious to invade the inmost recesses of your sanctum. It is an ingrained curiosity. And this feminine weakness which dates from Eve is a common motive in the stories of our oldest literature and folklore. What made Fatima so anxious to know the contents of the room forbidden her by Bluebeard? It was positively nothing to her, and its contents caused not the slightest annoyance to anybody. That story had a bad moral, and it would in many ways have been more satisfactory had the heroine been left to take her place in the blood-stained chamber, side by side with her peccant predecessors. Why need the women-folk, God forgive me, bother themselves about the inside of a man's library and whether it wants dusting or not? My boy's playroom, in which is a carpenter's bench, a lathe, and no end of litter, is never tidied. Perhaps it can't be, or perhaps their youthful vigor won't stand it. But my workroom must needs be dusted daily, with the delusive promise that each book and paper shall be replaced exactly where it was. The damage done by such continued treatment is incalculable. At certain times these observances are kept more religiously than others, but especially should the book-lover, married or single, beware of the Ides of March. So soon as February is dead and gone, a feeling of unrest seizes the housewife's mind. This increases day by day, and becomes dominant towards the middle of the month, about which period sundry hints are thrown out as to whether you are likely to be absent for a day or two. Beware, the fever called spring cleaning is on, and unless you stand firm you will rue it. Go away, if the fates so will, but take the key of your own domain with you. Do not misunderstand. Not for a moment would I advocate dust and dirt. They are enemies, and should be routed. But let the necessary routing be done under your own eye. Explain where caution must be used, and in what cases tenderness is a virtue. And if one Eve in the family can be indoctrinated with book reverence, you are a happy man. Her price is above that of rubies. She will prolong your life. Books must now and then be taken clean out of their shelves, but they should be tended lovingly and with judgment. If the dusting can be done just outside the room, so much the better. The books removed, the shelf should be lifted quite out of its bearings, cleansed and wiped, and then each volume should be taken separately and gently rubbed on back and sides with a soft cloth. In returning the volumes to their places, notice should be taken of the binding, and especially when the books are in whole calf or morocco, care should be taken not to let them rub together. The best bound books are soonest injured, and quickly deteriorate in bad company. Certain volumes, indeed, have evil tempers, and will scratch the faces of all their neighbors who are too familiar with them. Such are books with metal clasps or rivets on their edges, and such again are those abominable old rascals, chiefly born in the 15th century, who are proud of being dressed in real boards with brass corners, and pass their lives with fearful knobs and metal bosses, mostly 5 in number, firmly fixed on one of their sides. If the tendencies of such ruffians are not curbed, they will do as much mischief to their gentle neighbors as when a collie worries the sheep. These evil results may always be minimized by placing a piece of millboard between the culprit and his victim. I have seen lovely bindings sadly marked by such uncanny neighbors. When your books are being dusted, don't impute too much common sense to your assistants. Take their ignorance for granted and tell them at once never to lift any book by one of its covers. That treatment is sure to strain the back, and 10 to 1 the weight will be at the same time miscalculated and the volume will fall. Your female help, too, dearly loves a good tall pile to work at, and as a rule her notions of the center of gravity are not accurate, leading often to a general downfall and the damage of many a corner. Again, if not supervised and instructed, she is very apt to rub the dust into instead of off the edges. Each volume should be held tightly so as to prevent the leaves from gaping, and then wiped from the back to the fore edge. A soft brush will be found useful if there is much dust. The whole exterior should also be rubbed with a soft cloth, and then the covers should be opened and the hinges of the binding examined, for mildew will assert itself both inside and outside certain books, and that most pertinaciously. It has unaccountable likes and dislikes. Some bindings seem positively to invite damp, and mildew will attack these when no other books on the same shelf show any signs of it. When discovered, carefully wipe it away, and then let the book remain a few days standing open in the driest and airiest spot you can select. Great care should be taken not to let grit, such as blows in at the open window from many a dusty road, be upon your duster, or you will probably find fine scratches, like an outline map of Europe, all over your smooth calf, by which your heart and eye, as well as your book, will be wounded. Helps are very apt to fill the shelves too tightly, so that to extract a book you have to use force, often to the injury of the top bands. Beware of this mistake. It frequently occurs through not noticing that one small book is purposely placed at each end of the shelf, beneath the movable shelf supports, thus not only saving space, but preventing the injury which a book shelf high would be sure to receive from the uneven pressure. After all, the best guide in these, as in many other matters, is common sense, a quality which in olden times must have been much more common than in these days, else the phrase would never have become rooted in our common tongue. Children, with all their innocence, are often guilty of book murder. I must confess to having once taken down Humphrey's History of Writing, which contains many brightly colored plates, to amuse a sick daughter. That object was certainly gained, but the consequences of so bad a precedent were disastrous. That copy, which I am glad to say was easily replaced, notwithstanding great care on my part, became soiled and torn, and at last was given up to nursery martyrdom. Can I regret it? Surely not, for, although bibliographically sinful, who can weigh the amount of real pleasure received and actual pain ignored by the patient in the contemplation of those beautifully blended colors? A neighbor of mine, some few years ago, suffered severely from a propensity apparently irresistible in one of his daughters to tear his library books. She was 6 years old, and would go quietly to a shelf and take down a book or two, and having torn a dozen leaves or so down the middle, would replace the volumes, fragments and all, in their places, the damage being undiscovered until the books were wanted for use. Reprimand, expostulation, and even punishment were of no avail, but a single whipping effected a cure. Boys, however, are by far more destructive than girls, and have naturally no reverence for age, whether in man or books. Who does not fear a schoolboy with his first pocket-knife? As Wordsworth did not say, "You may trace him oft by scars which his activity has left upon our shelves and volumes, he who with pocket-knife will cut the edge of luckless panel or of prominent book, detaching with a stroke a label here, a backband there." Excursion 383. Pleased, too, are they, if with mouths full of candy and sticky fingers they can pull in and out the books on your bottom shelves, little knowing the damage and pain they will cause. One would fain cry out, calling on the shade of Horace to pardon the false quantity. Magna movet stomacho fastidia, si puer unctus, tractavit volumen manibus. What boys can do may be gathered from the following true story sent me by a correspondent who was the immediate sufferer. One summer day he met in town an acquaintance who for many years had been abroad, and finding his appetite for old books as keen as ever, invited him home to have a mental feed upon 15ers and other bibliographical dainties, preliminary to the coarser pleasures enjoyed at the dinner table. The home was an old mansion in the outskirts of London, whose very architecture was suggestive of black letter and sheepskin. The weather, alas, was rainy, and as they approached the house, loud peals of laughter reached their ears. The children were keeping a birthday with a few young friends. The damp forbade all outdoor play, and having been left too much to their own devices, they had invaded the library. It was just after the Battle of Balaclava, and the heroism of the combatants on that hard-fought field was in everybody's mouth. So the mischievous young imps divided themselves into two opposing camps, Britons and Russians. The Russian division was just inside the door, behind ramparts formed of old folios and quartos taken from the bottom shelves and piled to a height of about 4 feet. It was a wall of old fathers, 15th century chronicles, county histories, Chaucer, Lydgate, and such like. Some few yards off were the Britishers, provided with heaps of small books as missiles, with which they kept up a skirmishing cannonade against the foe. Imagine the tableau. 2 elderly gentlemen enter hurriedly, paterfamilias receiving, quite unintentionally, a first edition of Paradise Lost in the pit of his stomach, his friend narrowly escaping a closer personal acquaintance with a quarto Hamlet than he had ever had before. Finale, great outburst of wrath and rapid retreat of the combatants, many wounded, volumes being left on the field. Postscriptum. Although, strictly speaking, the following anecdote does not illustrate any form of real injury to books, it is so racy, and in these days of extravagant biddings so tantalizing, that I must step just outside the strict line of pertinence in order to place it on record. It was sent to me as a personal experience by my friend Mr. George Clulow, a well-known bibliophile and xylographer to ye set of ye odd volumes. The date is 1881. He writes, "Apropos of the Gainsborough find, of which you tell in The Enemies of Books, I should like to narrate an experience of my own of some 20 years ago. Late one evening at my father's house I saw a catalogue of a sale of furniture, farm implements, and books, which was announced to take place on the following morning at a country rectory in Derbyshire, some 4 miles from the nearest railroad station. It was summer time, the country at its best, and with the attraction of an old book, I decided on a day's holiday, and 8 o'clock the next morning found me in the train for C, and after a variation in my program, caused by my having walked 3 miles west before I discovered that my destination was 3 miles east of the railway station, I arrived at the rectory at noon, and found assembled some 30 or 40 of the neighboring farmers, their wives, men-servants, and maid-servants, all seemingly bent on a day's idling rather than business. The sale was announced for noon, but it was an hour later before the auctioneer put in an appearance, and the first operation in which he took part, and in which he invited my assistance, was to make a hearty meal of bread and cheese and beer in the rectory kitchen. This over, the business of the day began by a sundry collection of pots, pans, and kettles being brought to the competition of the public, followed by some lots of bedding, etc. The catalogue gave books as the first part of the sale, and as 3 o'clock was reached my patience was gone, and I protested to the auctioneer against his not selling in accordance with his catalogue. To this he replied that there was not time enough, and that he would sell the books tomorrow. This was too much for me, and I suggested that he had broken faith with the buyers, and had brought me to see on a false pretense. This, however, did not seem to disturb his good humour or to make him unhappy, and his answer was to call Bill, who was acting as porter, and tell him to give the gentleman the key of the book-room, and to bring down any of the books he might pick out, and he would sell 'em. I followed Bill, and soon found myself in a charming nook of a library full of books, mostly old divinity, but with a large number of the best miscellaneous literature of the 16th century, English and foreign. A very short look over the shelves produced some 30 black-letter books, 3 or 4 illuminated missals, and some book rarities of a more recent date. Bill took them downstairs, and I wondered what would happen. I was not long in doubt, for book by book, and in lots of 2 and 3, my selection was knocked down in rapid succession, at prices varying from 1 shilling 6 to 3 shillings 6, this latter sum seeming to be the utmost limit to the speculative turn of my competitors. The bonne bouche of the lot was, however, kept back by the auctioneer, because, as he said, it was a pretty book, and I began to respect his critical judgment, for a pretty book it was, being a large paper copy of Dibdin's Bibliographical Decameron, 3 volumes, in the original binding. Suffice it to say that, including this charming book, my purchases did not amount to £13, and I had pretty well a cartload of books for my money, more than I wanted much. Having brought them home, I weeded them out, and the weeding realized 4 times what I gave for the whole, leaving me with some real book treasures. Some weeks afterwards, I heard that the remainder of the books were literally treated as waste lumber and carted off to the neighbouring town, and were to be had, any one of them, for 6, from a cobbler who had allowed his shop to be used as a storehouse for them. The news of their being there reached the ears of an old bookseller in one of the large towns, and he, I think, cleared out the lot. So curious an instance of the most total ignorance on the part of the sellers, and I may add on the part of the possible buyers also, I think is worth noting. How would the reader, in this year of grace 1887, like such an experience as that? Conclusion. It is a great pity that there should be so many distinct enemies at work for the destruction of literature, and that they should so often be allowed to work out their sad end. Looked at rightly, the possession of any old book is a sacred trust, which a conscientious owner or guardian would as soon think of ignoring as a parent would of neglecting his child. An old book, whatever its subject or internal merits, is truly a portion of the national history. We may imitate it and print it in facsimile, but we can never exactly reproduce it, and as an historical document it should be carefully preserved. I do not envy any man that absence of sentiment which makes some people careless of the memorials of their ancestors, and whose blood can be warmed up only by talking of horses or the price of hops. To them solitude means ennui, and anybody's company is preferable to their own. What an immense amount of calm enjoyment and mental renovation do such men miss! Even a millionaire will ease his toils, lengthen his life, and add 100% to his daily pleasures if he becomes a bibliophile, while to the man of business with a taste for books, who through the day has struggled in the battle of life with all its irritating rebuffs and anxieties, what a blessed season of pleasurable repose opens upon him as he enters his sanctum, where every article wafts to him a welcome, and every book is a personal friend. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Maria Kasper. End of The Enemies of Books by William Blades.